Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of Sectionalism. Our questions to think about here. First, why was the Kansas-Nebraska Act created and how did it complicate the issue of slavery in the Louisiana Purchase? Second, why was the Republican Party created? Third, what other issues drove the two sections of the country apart? In 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois proposes building a transcontinental railroad from Chicago to the Pacific Ocean. But the problem for Douglas is that this proposed railroad is going to go through the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase, which means that any territorial development will eventually lead to more free states. The problem for Douglas is that he needs the support of Southern Democrats in order to get his railroad built. So he proposes overturning the Missouri Compromise with the so-called Kansas-Nebraska Act. The first thing this does is it creates the two territories, Kansas Territory and Nebraska Territory. The second thing that it does is it allows popular sovereignty on the issue of slavery. Now, the people who are going to settle in this area are probably going to be small wheat farmers and are probably going to not have any use for the institution of slavery. But by opening up this door to the possibility, it makes the idea of organizing these territories a little more agreeable to Southerners. So in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act overturns the Missouri Compromise, but in the process, it completely destroys the Whig Party. We mentioned before the separation between the Northern Conscience Whigs and the Southern Cotton Whigs. The Kansas-Nebraska Act just destroys the whole party. And then what ends up happening is many Northerners are going to leave the Democratic Party, which leaves Southerners in control of this party. The result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act is violence. When it came time for the elections to be held in Kansas, popular sovereignty didn't quite work out the way that Stephen Douglas had hoped it would. What ends up happening is huge numbers of Missouri residents, pro-slavery Missouri residents, end up hopping the border and voting illegally in the Kansas election. And it actually sways the election. And so there is a pro-slavery government established in Kansas. And the Free Staters, those who opposed slavery, recognized this voter fraud and declared that the pro-slavery government in Kansas was illegitimate. And so the result of the election is that we have not one, but two governments in Kansas, one pro-slavery and one anti-slavery. And so what ends up happening is essentially a small-scale civil war broke out between these rival regimes. And we could honestly argue that the Civil War doesn't begin in 1860 or 1861 in Virginia, but rather begins much earlier in Kansas as we see these armed conflicts between these rival factions. This all culminates in May of 1856 when pro-slavery adherents raided the Free State capital of Lawrence, Kansas. They essentially sacked the town, meaning they burned it to the ground. No one is killed, but abolitionists are going to want revenge for the attack on Lawrence. And so John Brown, who's actually from Maryland, has come to Kansas to avenge the attack on Lawrence. So John Brown leads a group of men on an attack of a pro-slavery settlement at Pottawatomie Creek. John Brown and his men dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers from their bed and murdered them in the streets in front of their families. This hit-and-run guerrilla warfare raged between the Free State and Slave State factions into the fall of 1856. But what happens next shocks the whole nation. Newspapers across the country have the headlines "Bleeding Kansas," and the violence in Kansas is actually going to spill over onto the floor of the United States Senate. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner gives a fiery speech on the floor of the Senate called "The Crime Against Kansas," in which he accuses Southerners of trying to extend slavery into Kansas territory. He even talks about the rape of Kansas. And in this fiery speech, Sumner calls out South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler, basically saying that the reason Butler and other Southerners want slavery to be legal is that they want to be able to continue to rape Black women. This is shocking. I mean, this is on the floor of the United States Senate. But Andrew Butler's an old man. He's not going to call out Charles Sumner for a duel or anything of the sort. But his kinsman, Congressman Preston Brooks, is going to get his revenge. On May 22nd, 1856, Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina marched into the Senate chamber, takes his cane, and proceeds to beat Charles Sumner nearly to death on the floor of the Senate. Preston Brooks hit Charles Sumner so hard and so many times that his cane broke over the man's head. Charles Sumner was seated at his desk, which was bolted to the floor, and in his effort to get away, he actually rips the bolts out of the floor and then topples over. Charles Sumner is so badly injured that he's not able to return to the Senate for 3 years. Preston Brooks, realizing that this is probably a bad career move, promptly resigns from the House of Representatives. He goes back home to South Carolina, where he discovers that his constituents have mailed him canes to replace the one he broke over Charles Sumner's head. And they promptly re-elected him to the House of Representatives. The collapse of the Whig Party created the opening for a new political party. Abolitionists in the North had earlier tried to form other political parties without much success. The problem was that abolitionist views were sort of like a spectrum. You had extremely liberal views that called for the immediate abolition of slavery, and even, this is the far, far left liberal view that Black men and white men should be equal, that African Americans should have voting rights and civil rights. To more moderate views that, yes, slavery is bad, but we don't know how to get rid of it. So into this comes the brand new Republican Party. And what's going to make them special is that they are going to try to embrace this wide spectrum of anti-slavery beliefs. But because they are created as an anti-slavery party, they're not going to have any appeal in the southern states. In 1856, the Republican Party is going to put up their very first presidential candidate, John C. Fremont. This guy is really well known nationally. He had been an explorer of the West. He had participated in the conquest of California during the Mexican-American War, and he was relatively moderate when it came to the issue of slavery, which appeals again to that broader spectrum of Northern voters. For the Democratic Party, they're going to nominate James Buchanan of Pennsylvania. And the biggest thing that James Buchanan has going for him is that he's been serving as a diplomat outside of the country for the last 10 years. So as all of these politicians have been embroiled in this slavery debate, James Buchanan's been out of the country. So that means that voters are able to project their own beliefs onto him. In addition to these two parties, we have a third party in this election. Former President Millard Fillmore is going to run on the American Party ticket. Now, we've already talked about the American Party before. We called them the Know Nothing Party. So their big appeal is going to be anti-immigrant sentiments. When we take a look at the results, the election of 1856 was really two separate races. One in the north between Fremont and Buchanan, and the other one in the south between Fillmore and Buchanan. And because Buchanan was appealing to both Northerners and Southerners, he is the winner of this election. One of the other issues that's driving Northerners and Southerners apart was the Dred Scott case. This is a Supreme Court case heard in 1857. The plaintiff in the case was a Missouri slave, Dred Scott, who sued for his freedom on the grounds that he had lived for many years in an area where slavery had been outlawed by the Missouri Compromise. Dred Scott's owner was an army doctor, and they had traveled a lot and lived in a lot of different areas, including Illinois, Wisconsin Territory, Missouri, Louisiana, and then when they get back to Missouri, the doctor dies. And when Dred Scott and the rest of the doctor's property are inherited by a kinsman, that's when Dred Scott sues for his freedom. Now, what's interesting about this is the man in the upper right here, Roger B. Taney. He's a throwback. This is the man who removed the deposits from the Bank of the United States during the time of Andrew Jackson's presidency. When he did that, he earned the respect and loyalty of Andrew Jackson, who then made him the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So initially, the Supreme Court is going to throw out this case on the argument that slaves are not citizens of the United States and cannot sue in court. But President-elect James Buchanan, that's what we call the president between the time when he's elected and when he takes the oath of office. So during that intermittent period, he is president-elect. So President-elect Buchanan is looking to solve the issue of slavery in the territories once and for all. And he's hoping that the Supreme Court will take this off his hands. So on March 6th, 1857, Justice Taney argued that Dred Scott would not have won his case even if he had been a legal plaintiff, because his residence in the Wisconsin Territory established no right to freedom because Congress had no power to prohibit slavery there. So this is a blanket argument in the sense that essentially, the Supreme Court has just declared that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional and slavery is now legal in all territories. Of course, Southerners are going to be very happy with the Dred Scott decision. Northerners are going to be completely outraged. Another incident that's going to divide the country is another incident involving John Brown. We've already mentioned John Brown over in Kansas. He was the one who instigated the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. But now he's back in Maryland, and he's hoping to start a slave rebellion. So in 1859, John Brown organizes a raid on a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He's hoping to take control of this federal arsenal and to distribute the guns and weapons to slaves to start a rebellion. On October 16th, 1859, his men were able to seize control of the arsenal, but they're immediately surrounded by a contingent of the United States Army. A shootout happens, and John Brown and most of the men are captured. John Brown was found guilty of committing treason and hanged. For Southerners, this was proof that abolitionists were crazy and that they were dangerous. But for Northerners, John Brown was a martyr, a saint to the cause of abolitionism. So once again, this is a wedge that's driving the two sections of the country apart. Looking at our questions to think about, why was the Kansas-Nebraska Act created, and how did it complicate the issue of slavery in the Louisiana Purchase? The Kansas-Nebraska Act was created because Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois wanted to build a transcontinental railroad, but he knew that Southerners were never going to support that as long as the Missouri Compromise was in place, because that meant any new territory would be on the path to become a free state. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act complicates the issue of slavery in the Louisiana Purchase because it opens up the door to popular sovereignty. But the result is definitely not what Stephen Douglas had wanted. Second, why was the Republican Party created? It was created to be an anti-slavery party. Once the Whig Party collapsed, it opened up the door for a new political party. And it's created to be specifically an anti-slavery party, which means it contributes to the sectionalism of the era. Third, what other issues drove the two sections apart? We have the Dred Scott case, which is going to drive the country apart because Northerners thought this was a terrible decision. Southerners supported it. And so again, driving the country apart. And then finally, John Brown's raid, which was an attempt to start a slave revolt, failed. And it's a sign to Southerners that abolitionists are crazy. But John Brown becomes a saint to the cause of abolitionism. So stay tuned for part 3 of sectionalism.